Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism, but with only two of the three usual Marks, myself and Mark Melton, addressing three pieces appearing in Providence this week, one by a new contributor, a young woman named Braulia Ribeiro. Hopefully Mark Melton can correct my pronunciation, who wrote a very insightful piece called Transcendence and Poverty, Lessons from Brazil, about the influence of Pentecostalism there. Secondly, a piece I wrote about a New York Times op-ed penned by three integralists advocating a more quote unquote restrained US foreign policy. And then finally, a reposting of a piece from our iconic father publication, Christianity in Crisis, from 75 years ago by David Bennett, Reinhold Niebuhr's cohort, on the need for evangelism, which was as controversial then as it is now. But first, this piece on Brazil, from which I want to briefly quote, talking about the transformative effect of a particular new Pentecostal congregation in a slum of a Brazilian city. And the author concludes rather poignantly that the activity to locate oneself in the transcendent universe transports individual existence. That is the contention of Eric Voegelin in his work about the order of history. Transcendence positions the individual in the flow of history beyond what the immanent society offers to him or her. It attributes meaning to concrete experience without devaluing it. So this is in part why Pentecostalism is so popular in Brazil, especially, but certainly throughout the global South, most particularly in Africa. Mark Melton, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I could probably say a couple of things on this. So I think her name is Ribeiro. I'm not sure exactly the Portuguese, how that's pronounced, but anyway, so she's writing about this documentary that actually came out a while ago about this church in Brazil, Pentecostal church, and how it was able to influence the community for the better, and how even according to what she was writing, the value of the houses, even though I think the houses around this slum area were illegal, like those were worth more and people wanted to live there and not further away. And so the church had a lot of positive benefits to the rest of society, and how it's kind of counterintuitive because the Pentecostals had all these rules of things you can't do. And so if I remember correctly, the directors or the people producing the documentary were kind of curious as to why did people want to participate in something that told you you can't do this or that. And like you said, the kind of justification is that, well, they the faith gave the people hope, it gave them meaning, and an eternal meaning that just the materialist world around us would not give. And so she writes about poverty and how according to these people, like the poverty wasn't necessarily a lack of material goods, but the lack of eternal hope. And so I think that kind of ties into, we talked a while ago about our Advent series on hope. And so I feel like, this would have been a good piece if it had come in around that time. So it could have fit in very easily into that series of hope about, what is it that we hope for in the world? Because there's a lot of things that we can be downbeat on. And so the kind of the second point here is, it reminds me of when I was living in France, and the only church I really found there that people actually went to was a Pentecostal church that was in a hole in the wall. Yeah, I think it might have been a storefront that was converted into like a little makeshift church. When I tried to go to the Catholic churches, which were the dominant ones in this town, massive buildings, they even had like Republique Française over the doors because they were pre-1905 built churches. So I believe the state owned and operated or maintained them, which a lot of people don't, I think, realize that the laicite laws in France allow that. But this Pentecostal church was far outperforming it. Whenever I tried to go to the Catholic churches, they were empty, they're closed. Like they basically, what they did is they would rotate mass, and I was never able to figure out when mass would occur on the Sunday in the church nearby. But like this Pentecostal church had a community of people there. And so it's interesting that not just in the global South, but you see in other parts of the world where this Pentecostalism is very powerful. And I think a lot of points that I could make, I think I might save for when we talk about the evangelism article with Bennett.
Well, next, my piece on an integralist foreign policy versus a Christian realist foreign policy. We addressed this topic a bit in our conversation last week. The New York Times op-ed by Sohrab, Amari Gladden-Pappin, and Patrick Deneen, although not referenced in their article, they are integralist and part of the New Right, advocating a U.S. withdrawal from the world, in essence saying because the U.S. is, from their perspective, decadent, we should be focusing on social and moral, spiritual renewal at home and not promoting American values universally. I critique their piece from several perspectives. One, I should think that a truly integralist perspective connected to the historic teachings of the Catholic Church would be much more realist in terms of understanding that the world intrinsically is a competition among nations and competing interests. So to think that if America withdraws, that somehow there is going to be a peaceful result is by definition unrealistic. Also, a more integralist America that would be, according to their vision and dream, a Catholic confessional state, arguably would be far more prone to war and conflict than the current pluralistic America, in that a theocracy by matter of principle would be much more drawn to combating ideological and theological rivals around the world. China and Russia certainly would be chief rivals to any Catholic confessional state in the United States of America. And then finally, I make the point that no wise nation living realistically and pragmatically has the luxury of focusing exclusively on its own interior spiritual uplift and sanctification while ignoring the rest of the world. This is the struggle and challenge for all nations in all times, dealing with their domestic troubles and failures while also seeing to their security from potential external threats. Any thoughts, Mark Melton?
Well, one line I kind of highlighted here. In fact, I think when I was scheduling tweets for Providence, I used this for one of the tweets. If not already, then it will be scheduled, come out soon. But like you write, all nations have their tawdry internal corruptions that should preclude national sanctimony, but wise nations abjure naivete and don't pretend they can sustain peace and security by closing their eyes and praying for their own sanctification. And that line kind of reminded me of what Reinhold Niebuhr wrote in the mid-40s, talking about the pride of victors. When fighting literal Nazis, he's like, do not be prideful, even though they are bad. Like, you defeat them, but don't think that you are eternally better than these Germans you've defeated. Like, we still suffer from original sin. Some Christian groups, Catholics, I believe wouldn't say this, but believe in total depravity and the idea of like, even if you try to do good, then you can't do good. Even if you do good, you sometimes do it for the wrong reasons, which means you didn't do good. And so between original sin and depravity, we will always have internal corruptions. And just because like America has internal corruptions doesn't mean that it is evil, doesn't mean that it can't be a force for good in the world, or so it does seem to me that this and other writings I've seen from them, a demand for a certain purity that is not possible, that is unrealistic and naive, as you say. And so my concern with kind of the integralist view in general is that I think it underappreciates just how deep depravity runs through our hearts and also our churches. Like I think we can see where churches can screw up, and that I think the best check for that is both renewal, but also allowing churches to fade if they become corrupted, but instead of privileging them and trying to prop them up. That's the reason why I support religious freedom and the idea of, I've written about this before, but the idea of a freedom market of churches.
And finally, John Bennett on evangelism, writing in 1947, but he could be writing in 2022, talking about the controversial aspects of evangelism, and yet the need for the world in 1947, still reeling from the impact of World War II and entering into the Cold War in need of spiritual renewal, America in need of spiritual renewal. There had not been a spiritual revival in America even during World War II, but he notes many soldiers serving in the war had experienced a personal spiritual renewal. He sees no great hope for civilizational revival without a spiritual revival, which requires, by definition, evangelism by the church. And the church has a responsibility to share the gospel with all who are willing to listen. Pertinent and wise words then and now. What think you, Mark Melton?
Yeah, so like you said, he's talking about, the need for evangelism. And, at this time, apparently people were talking about how evangelism, what they associated with narrowness and intolerance and spiritual imperialism. And he says, basically, it's trying to tell people about the gospel. It also, like, the writing is a little vague, but kind of like reading over it over and over, it seems that he is responding to a contemporary critique at that time that said that, not a critique, but a view that, if we convince people that the church is good for you for these secular worldly reasons, like it's good for, I can't remember these, but your health, your wealth, your
moral.
I can't remember because there's other articles in Christianity in Crisis that talked about, I think, like, different worldly ends that could be attained by going to church. And he's like, that's not what's really going to draw people into the church. What's going to draw them into the church is that they find God in the worship. And that, like, there can be secondary benefits, but that's not the main driving factor. Is that people find God in the worship, that the worship reaches them. In other words, there is an evangelism there is genuine faith. You don't go to church, in other words, because it's good business. I know some people would say, well, there's an argument of going to church because you get to meet people who will get you businesses, or, sometimes people are like, so there's a secular or a worldly view of, like, I'm going there to meet people. That's not the main drive that's really going to sustain a church. It's going to be the spiritual benefit. And I think that connects to the Brazil article in that documentary of, like, yes, there were these secondary benefits that helped the community, but the main driving factor was that the people were able to have a spiritual relationship with God because of that. And so it is finding the genuine faith that is the primary point of the church. And so that's why I think I titled this Evangelism First. And so my point with that is, first you got to go after the evangelism. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is a benefit. Everything else is a blessing. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes there can still, I think, be failures within the society despite, the church doing its job. Just because there was Christianity spreading in the Roman Empire didn't save the Roman Empire. It still fell apart. And I think for the betterment of the world. That could be a controversial point maybe for our different contributors, but that's coming from a Celtic heritage. I think it's better that the Roman way. But so in other words, like, there can still be benefits even if the world falls apart around the church, and that God can still have a plan that we may not understand in that moment. So I know I probably rambled a little bit there, but hope that answered your question.
Well, that's the Celtic perspective anyway on the Roman Empire. It's interesting to have this appeal for evangelism from Christianity in Crisis magazine, in that Reinhold Niebuhr and Christian realism are not typically associated with evangelism. And Niebuhr himself had a critique of Billy Graham and his great evangelistic outreach through global crusades. And yet there it is. So thank you for this latest episode of Marksism, Mark Melton. And until next week, hopefully with the third Mark Levecki. Till then, bye-bye.